This is a Virginia Museum of Veiled History production, copyright 2017, Social Justice Connections, LLC, written by Larry Lamar Yates. From the mid-1920s to the early 1960s, from the era of the Scopes monkey trial to the era of the March at Selma, no political decisions were made in Virginia without the input of Harry Flood Byrd Sr., and few political decisions were made without his complete agreement. Only J. Edgar Hoover held personal political power longer in the 20th century USA. Byrd's political machine included most elected officials, local elected officials, of which Virginia had a number: clerks, sheriffs, finance officials, as well as mayors and county supervisors. Together, they had enough influence to control a small and docile electorate. Byrd's support was strongest in the Black Belt of Southside Virginia, a focus of segregationist thought and large black populations dominated by small white populations. Weakest in the Appalachian Southwest, which felt disconnected from Virginia, and then as time went on, weakening in urban areas. But there was no place in Virginia where the power of Harry Flood Byrd Sr. could be ignored during these 40 years. These years did not just happen to be the heyday of Jim Crow in Virginia and across the South. Harry Flood Byrd Sr. was not a fiscal and political conservative who just happened to have the bad luck to be in power during the height of U.S. apartheid. He didn't just happen to have to go along. Harry Flood Byrd Sr. was a Jim Crow man. Massive resistance was not simply a sad lapse of leadership, writes historian Brent Tarter. It was the logical consequence of the beliefs and actions of Harry Byrd and his closest allies. A deliberate, systematic denial of the basic rights of American citizenship, perpetrated with malice aforethought. Massive resistance is the racist initiative Byrd is remembered for. But Virginia, and especially African American Virginians, suffered many other racist initiatives during his 40 years in power. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 established the role of the Commonwealth of Virginia in determining the race of every citizen from birth. The state registrar of vital statistics of the Byrd years avidly pursued anyone he believed was trying to pass for white, or in fact anyone claiming any identity other than colored or white, including Indians. And this law, of course, determined who could marry who, could go to what school, be in what profession. It really controlled your life. Enforcement of Jim Crow laws. By the time Harry Flood Byrd Sr. came to power, segregation of schools had been in place for many decades. Segregation of public transportation went into effect around 1900. However, public meetings could still legally be racially integrated, though they rarely were. So a law to solve this problem, quote unquote, was passed just before Byrd became governor. All of these segregation laws were vigorously enforced during the 4 decades of Byrd machine rule. The Virginia Sterilization Act empowered the staffs of Virginia's mental hospitals, as well as the frighteningly named State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, to sterilize their inmates. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of sterilization based on a Virginia case, and this sterilization continued until 1979. As many as 8,300 people were sterilized, with the highest rates during the 1930s, very much part of Byrd's years in power. Opposition to civil rights laws. As a U.S. Senator, Byrd opposed every civil rights law that came before him. He played an important part in organizing the Southern Manifesto of 1956, putting most Southern members of Congress on record against desegregation. His major biographer, Ronald Heidemann, wrote that his votes against civil rights and welfare legislation revealed a parochialism that bordered on meanness and miserliness. Benefiting from voting restrictions on black people, every day that Harry Flood Byrd Sr. was in office, he benefited from the work of the 1902 constitutional coup, from the fact that the restricted electorate that actually voted was far whiter, wealthier, and more conservative than Virginia overall. His machine eagerly enforced the laws and regulations that came out of 1902. Official pro-rebellion education and ceremonies. From the 1870s, the Commonwealth of Virginia funded propaganda for the pro-slavery rebellion in textbooks, in monuments, on markers, in ceremonies and speeches, even putting Confederate veterans on trains and moving them from one city to another to meet together. All of these government-funded programs reinforced the fanatical white supremacist ideas of the Byrd regime. Justice or just us? During Harry Flood Byrd Sr.'s time in power, there were executions of 103 black men and 16 white men. Of these, 28 of the black men were executed for rape. No white men in Virginia were executed for this crime after 1868. 87% of all those executed were black, at a time when black Virginians amounted to a quarter to 20% of the Commonwealth's population. Virginia's prisons in Harry Flood Byrd Sr.'s time were vicious institutions. Reforming attorney and author Howard Carwile investigated the system and found abuses like handcuffing prisoners over a barrel, flogging them with 39 blows. In 1946, the publicity and attention brought to this resulted in this flogging being banned. The editor and publisher of the Byrd-owned Winchester Star were most offended by the part of my letter dealing with lynching and Howard Walker, my responses to a previous letter to the Star. That previous letter had praised Harry Flood Byrd Sr. for getting a state anti-lynching law passed. I pointed out that Byrd opposed lynchings because they were not an elite supported activity, but that he fully supported unjust and racist executions. There was nothing new about a conservative and racist Virginia governor opposing lynchings. The Virginia elite has never welcomed any mobs. In the 1890s, Governor O'Farrell repeatedly sent troops to stop lynchings, but not because he opposed racism. He fully supported the Jim Crow laws going into effect. He denounced the mob spirit, which he saw just as much in unions and protests as in lynchings. The oligarchic structure of Virginia was instinctively conservative and resistant to profound change, wrote an expert on lynching in the New South. Letting racist mobs do the job of the courts and the gallows was repellent to Virginia conservatives of the 1890s and of the Byrd years. The elite-controlled legal system could do the job that lynching was expected to do. The story of Howard Walker shows us Harry Flood Byrd Sr.'s comfort level with racist executions. These events happened right here in this Winchester community within blocks of this museum. Howard Walker was born around 1916 here in Winchester, about 4 blocks north of this museum. This picture is from his time at Douglas School, the school for black children in Winchester at that time. In his 20s, he became quite a local star. Howdy Walker, the quarterback of the Brown Bombers, a popular semi-pro football team. The Winchester Star wrote him up in October 1941, noting that the Brown Bombers defeated a strong Martinsburg colored team and that the game's touchdown, the one touchdown, was made by Howdy Walker. In 1944, this handsome young black man was apparently having an affair with a white woman whose husband was fighting overseas. This is the story as Peter Schmidt, a local author, told it in his novel, Gabriel's Redemption, a fictionalized version of Walker's story based on what black Winchester residents had told Schmidt. In March 1944, Walker was charged with raping the woman. Falsely told a lynch mob was gathering around the courthouse, he confessed within 36 hours. He was executed in May, 2 months later, at the state penitentiary in Richmond. NAACP efforts to intervene were fruitless, though the local Winchester branch did form as a result of black community reaction to this injustice. So this 2 months process was the Byrd machine's alternative to lynching. But as the Star staff emphasized to me, Harry Flood Byrd Sr., a U.S. Senator at the time, had no direct role in this process. Yes, Harry Flood Byrd Sr. had no direct role in this process, but he certainly knew what was happening to Walker, as was reported regularly on the front page of his own newspaper. And as the most powerful man in Virginia, and certainly in the Winchester area, Byrd could have stopped or slowed down the injustice done to Howard Walker with a whisper in the right ear or an editorial hint. 2 years later, the judge who sentenced Walker to death, Burr Harrison, known as a Byrd man, got the nod of the machine and became a U.S. congressman. Again, there's no hint of Byrd disapproval here. With the publication of Schmidt's book in 2012, the story came to light again and was discussed in Winchester schools and media. Few defended the original injustice, but the name of Harry Flood Byrd Sr. only came up in passing. His hands were clean. Harry Flood Byrd Sr.'s family first made history in Virginia in the 1600s. But his wealth came not from his family, but from his businesses, especially apple growing. And while being a Byrd and being Virginia's most powerful man hardly repelled opportunities for wealth, he gained little, if anything, from political corruption or favors. His wealth did, though, make it possible for him to be the gracious host of his petty constituents and of presidents and potentates alike in lavish events. Harry Flood Byrd Sr. worked hard to give the impression of a humble country gentleman farmer. But whether in Washington, D.C., or almost anywhere in Virginia, he was known by everyone who mattered. So he did not need an entourage or a busy public relations apparatus. But his life was never one of leisure. His biographer, Ronald Heinemann, tells us his relationships beyond his family were all carefully cultivated for their political usefulness. While Harry Flood Byrd Sr. consistently held the conservative, lost cause-based beliefs of his childhood, he shifted his loyalties from the National and Democratic Party to becoming a Republican in all but name. He spoke about the Solid South, but he was never really an ally for any politician outside Virginia. It was Virginia that mattered to him. And not just Virginia, but a Byrd Virginia. Racist, cautious, unkind, but with a show of graciousness and tradition. Byrd Virginia, racist, cautious, unkind, but with a show of graciousness and tradition, was held firmly in place for 40 years by a man with remarkable political talent, backed up by a solid elitist position, and by the 1902 Constitution's devastation of Virginia suffrage. It was held so firmly in place that its grip can still be felt across the Commonwealth. Even though the politics of the state changed following the death of Harry Byrd and the collapse of his organization in the 1960s, many of the core values and political practices, writes Brent Tarter, that sustained the organization during much of the 20th century remained in force even into the 21st century.